Hello, my name is Gurminder Bhambra and I'm president of the British Sociological Association. I'm delighted to be here today with Natasha Carver to discuss her excellent book, Marriage, Gender and Refugee Migration, which won the 2022 Philip Abrams Memorial Prize from the British Sociological Association. This prize is given to the best first and sole authored book within the discipline of sociology, and it was established in honour of the memory of Professor Philip Abrams, whose work contributed substantially to sociology and social policy research in Britain. Welcome, Natasha. I'm so pleased to be in conversation with you about your book. It was a deserved winner of the Philip Abrams Memorial Prize, and in the citation, the committee said the following: "This is a compelling study of Somali migrants in the UK and their views on marriage and gender. The work is deeply reflexive and reveals that Carver is a sensitive and skilled researcher. She offers keen sociological insights which are conveyed beautifully and makes an excellent contribution to family studies, particularly to doing family in the context of migration." So could we perhaps start with you telling us something about what developed your interest in this particular community? Maybe tell us something about yourself and how you came to be interested in examining the ways in which gender relations and gender identities are contested and reproduced through migration.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much. Thank you also for the award. It really means a huge amount to me. So before I came into academia, I worked for 10 years as an immigration caseworker, and that involves representing people, advising people on their immigration claims. I was working in legal aid, so it's mostly with asylum seekers and also those seeking to bring in family members. So for half of the time I worked in London, and then in the second 5 years I was working in Bristol, where there is a large Somali population. So naturally I kind of got to know quite a lot about Somali sort of family relationships and dynamics. I was particularly struck at the high rate of refusals for Somalis. They seemed to me to being refused at a much higher proportion than other nationals, other nationalities. And this was confirmed when I read the work of Professor Catherine Charsley, who had done a sort of analysis of Home Office statistics through freedom of information requests, and she discovered that actually they were being refused at a rate of around 60%. That's in marriage applications, which was much, much higher than any other nationality. So I really wanted to find out why. So I wanted to explore that further. And I had an idea that it was to do with gender and the presentation of Muslim women. I thought perhaps entry clearance officers had a very particular role, a particular kind of stereotype in mind when they imagined a Muslim marriage. And also there's guidance where an arranged marriage is described, and it's very a narrow example of what an arranged marriage might look like, which didn't really fit my Somali client. So I wanted to explore that further. Okay. So, I did all the preparation that you do, and I went out to do my fieldwork armed with my sort of information sheet, which said this research is about Somali marriage. But when I got out there, people started sort of saying to me, "Oh yes, divorce, it's a big problem." So I took an inductive approach, and I followed their lead, and that led me to focusing on spousal relations after refugee migration, with a particular focus on gender roles and the necessity of reproducing those in the context of refugee migration.
That's an incredible sort of entry in. And I was just wondering, I mean, before we get into discussing more about the book itself, what you see as might be the difference between approaching refugee issues from the work that you did previously around advocacy or support, and then are coming to this from a more academic sort of perspective. Did you see a difference in terms of any aspect of constraints or ways in which you might engage?
Yeah, I think there, as an academic researcher and a lawyer, you have a very different role, and that particularly around the right to know and the right to challenge. So as a lawyer, you kind of have this right to know what you need to know from your clients, and you can ask them very directly, and you also have a responsibility to challenge them and to say, well, the Home Office is going to say, I don't believe you, or whatever. So to challenge those narratives. And also, working at the kind of coalface, if you like, I don't know any immigration advisor who's in it for the money. People are in it because they passionately believe in helping people. And it gives you a perspective, a very strong perspective on what research is needed and why. When you're in academia, you're kind of much more removed from that. So you lose, in a sense, some of your policy perspective, that kind of directness, that immediacy. But at the same time, you're very differently placed to from the client-lawyer relationship, because you are asking people for their time, and it's a much more gentle sort of please, can you help me discover stuff, rather than I'm helping you kind of thing. So that relationship is completely different, but that gives you the luxury, and it is a luxury, to really listen to people, which lawyers just don't have, because they're driven by these kind of legal aid time constraints, etc. And it allows you to take up issues which are important to participants, which is what I did with my research. So I followed their lead, because they said, no, this is what's important to us, not what you think is important, but this. And that was a really, it is a luxury, and it's a really amazing thing to be able to do.
So the ethnographic research within the book, I mean, it's incredibly rich, and you draw on a lot of interviews and observations, and there's really interesting stories that you sort of pull out as well. And we'll perhaps talk about a couple of those later. But could you perhaps first say something about what did you, as a broad brushstroke, what do you consider to be the key findings from the research that you did?
Well, I think the book provides a corrective to public and political narratives on Muslim women, in inverted commas. I think that there's a very strong political and media narrative which paints Muslim women as kind of subservient, as docile, as passive, and this book doesn't do that at all. I hope it allows women to, well, it showcases both women and men, but it really is showing the diversity of people and difference. But also, I think I wanted really to show how these women were using Islam to challenge gender norms. So there's a kind of, I guess, the second thing that the book does is to think about how the way we think about gender in a kind of Western feminist way has got its limitations. And it's very much bound up with kind of Enlightenment notions, if you like, of kind of grand narratives of progress. So I'm talking here about understandings of the family and the individualization thesis. And I think a lot of sociological thinking around the family and family relationships is really heavily steeped in Eurocentrism. So both in terms of the empirical work that's done, but also the assumption that what holds for Europe is universal. And the political discourse on Muslim women, if you like, we can almost see it as an updated version of the colonial discourse, which produced kind of Western women as free agents and colonized women as kind of unliberated. And we can see the same kind of discourse happening if you look at the government's, the Casey Review, for example, which is the government sort of report on integration. It has a very similar kind of stereotype of Western women as free agents and Muslim women as unliberated and caught up by repressive ideologies. And the book really challenges that notion. So these women were using Islam to talk back to husbands from all sorts of things about, everyday things like doing the dishes, all the way up to whether a woman can be raped in marriage, or to challenge female genital circumcision, for example. So they were using Islamic knowledge and Islamic praxis to push back against what they saw as cultural patriarchal ideologies, both in Somalia culture, but also the UK culture.
I think one of the things that really comes out in the book is what strong characters the people you interviewed are. And there's a real sense of dynamism and vibrancy to the ways in which you've sort of presented them and presented the conversations that emerged out of your interactions. And that's a really, and the way that you then also represent those conversations in a particular notational form and thinking through. And you said that one of the reasons that you wanted to present the conversations in that way was partly because the Somali language is also very poetic and engages with proverbs and allusions and so on. So was that an explicit sort of push to thinking about the ways in which you would present the information?
Absolutely. So I was driven all the way through by a massive concern about representation, because however ethically you do the research, you know, the ultimate fact is, as the author, you are the author. You end up having control over that process. And you know, I wasn't so naive as to think I could kind of, you know, give voice to people or anything like that. But I listened, you know, to my recordings again and again and again. And the more I listened, that I began to notice this kind of, there was a poetic delivery. It wasn't something that happened, you know, in the first incarnation of the research. It really took it was a long process to arrive at this point. And I just thought, if I write this on the page as prose, I can't convey to the reader the dynamism, as you say, the kind of the character, and everybody was an individual. And I didn't want to end up with this kind of monolithic, this is the Somali voice kind of thing. And I wanted their individuality to come through, but it seemed to me quite a clumsy thing to have to state that each time, to say, you know, this person was like this and blah, 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 to try and, you know, paint a picture, if you like, when it could be done through words and through imagery on the page. So the more and more I listened, the more I realized that not all of the participants, but some of the participants were actually incredibly skilled at delivering words at all, you know, and they were using poetic formations, sort of blocks of 2 or 3, and a lot of rhythm often as well, to really put their points across. And the more reading I did on this, I relied particularly on Catherine Reisman's work on narrative analysis and ethnopoetics. And the more reading I did, I realized that, you know, ethnopoetics was the tool, if you like, which could capture some of this. But I wanted to go beyond the conventional ethnopoetics, because I didn't want to write out my own role in the creation of this. So I was very much thinking about, how do I break down this fourth wall and remind the reader that I'm here too, and this isn't just a kind of, you know, somebody else speaking kind of thing. So my recourse there was to this notion of concrete poetry, which there's a very famous French example where it's called Il pleut, it rains, and the words literally rain down the page. So I wanted to bring some of that idea into the presentation on the page, so that people were constantly, every time they saw a quotation, they were being reminded both that this is not me, but also that this is me at the same time. So that that kind of dual responsibility, if you like, as researcher, but also representing other people in the book.
And do you think, you know, because I was just thinking about this as you were speaking, that there's so much, if you like, ethical reflection within the book. You're very careful to indicate that you're speaking about, not speaking for, that these are reflections that emerge in the context of conversations, and that way of presenting is constantly also reminding the reader of, if you like, the voice of the other, but the fact that some of that is also elicited through your interjections and so on. And could this be is this something that you wish to develop as a tool for researchers to provoke them to be more ethical?
Definitely, yes. I'm so tired of reading research where the interviewer is kind of absent entirely, and you think, how did they come up with this notion, you know? And also, one thing I realized, when you listen to your recordings, it's a really good exercise to listen just to yourself, and not the first time you listen, don't listen to what the person's saying, just listen to what you do and you say. And I began to realize through that process that, you know, I said yes at different points. So I had a whole repertoire. You know, yes meant keep going, I totally agree with you. Meant, yeah, I'm kind of with you. There was which might mean I'm not quite following you. No, those basically are affirmative responses, if you like. They've got a whole repertoire, which we do subconsciously. And when you begin to read and notice them, then you can really see where you're actually telling the participant, you're on the right lines of what I want to hear, keep talking, or you need to explain this more because I don't understand, or no, you're talking about something completely different and I'm not with you. And so I wanted those interjections to be there on the page so that people could really see, and not just, you know, at the very first incarnation, I actually called myself researcher. And then I thought, no, hold on a second, that's denying me, the person. That's just presuming that the researchers are monolithic, you know, and then they're not, and they're not. So then I put myself in as Natasha, you know, so Natasha says yes. And that is a real indication of the fact that, you know, I really strongly believe that these are co-produced, you know, whatever data you get in an interview setting is co-produced, whether you ask one question or 50 questions. It's a co-produced production, because your very presence and defines, you know, and even your body language is indication to the other person as to whether they should continue speaking or stop speaking, or all those kind of subtle things we do without thinking.
Yes, it was great. I mean, as you were speaking there, I was thinking, how do you transcribe you know, those voices? And you've got that in the page as well. So it's really, really nice. Let's talk about one of the stories that you have in a later chapter. So you're discussing two migration stories of a couple, Hebo and Derek. And there are differences in how they moved from Somalia, well, from sort of Kenya and Somalia as well, I guess, and to Europe. And then you're also sort of pulling out differences in the way in which Hebo is narrating both of their journeys in particular ways. And so I was wondering, could you just tell us something about these individuals and their journeys, and then the ways in which these journeys were represented by Hebo?
Yeah, so I used a tool in my interview called a migration history chart. And that's basically where you go back in time. So you start by saying, okay, well, we're in Bristol now. How many years have you lived here? And you go back in time for all the significant places that a person might have lived over their life. And it's a way of, it's a very useful way, especially in migration research, because it doesn't start with borders and countries as its kind of premise, or visas and all that kind of stuff. So it allows people to tell you the places that were important to them and how they saw it, you know. So rather than people saying, well, I moved from Somalia to Bristol, I got people sort of saying, well, I moved from this village to that town to this town, you know. So it was much more about localities and where was important to them. And through the course of that process, Hebo told me her husband's sort of journey and her own journey. And when I put these side by side after I transcribed them, I noticed how there were sort of major similarities in the sense of this was a very poetic delivery. There were stanzas, you know, you could clearly see they matched each other. So there were kind of like a stanza about early life, and then about primary school, and then about secondary school, and, you know, and they matched each other sort of in the form, but the content was really markedly different. So Hebo talked about her husband as though he were entirely a free agent. So he was born into the nomadic tradition, and she says at the age of sort of 8 or 9, he decided to go and live with an uncle in a town because he wanted to get education, and then later on he decides to move to Mogadishu because he wants to go to university. And so everything that happens to him, there were no borders presented. I mean, social borders or national borders, even though he did actually cross some national borders, but they were not presented at all in the story. And also there were no parents, you know, they were just, everyone was there as a kind of, he was in control, he was master of his destiny. And then when she spoke about her own journey, it was entirely the other way. So there were borders everywhere, in terms of social borders as to where and how she could go to school, but also national borders. So it mattered that she was Somali in Kenya, and she had to hold a piece of paper which designated her as such, and the difficulty she had to get a passport and all those kind of difficulties. But also there was a sense that she had no agency, you know, her parents and these borders and the social situation dictated everything. But then the moment of migration was presented as a sharp contrast. So Derek's story kind of ended when the war came. It was kind of like literally said, and then the war started, and that was full stop. And from then on, he loses all agency. Whereas she begins her agency when she decides to go to Europe, to travel to Europe. And as soon as she's in Europe, she has a 6-month visa. She's absolutely in control. She's like, I met him, I married him, and then we had children, and then I decided I wanted to move to Bristol, so I went, you know, and suddenly she has all the agency and he is following her, and it becomes kind of her dependent, if you like, and in that journey, in that story. So I saw this almost as a metaphor for the changing gender relationships and the changing gender roles between, or how she saw it at least, between Somalia and the UK, but also how social borders and boundaries are so tied up with national borders and boundaries as well. And I did a lot of historical research, so I went back into the times that she was talking about, and I discovered that the reason he could go to school at that age was because of this national literacy campaign and program that had just started. So free education had just been made available. So although she presented it as entirely as like his decision, there were many actual sort of political factors that were helping those decisions come about. And then later on, there was a war, which meant he got a position in the police, and all these different things that were happening, which were silenced effectively, just giving him all the agency. So I just thought that was a really interesting story to bring out those differences and the changing gender relations.
No, it was fascinating. And I was just wondering, did you get a chance to speak to Derek as well? Because how did he interpret? Did he see himself as being fully agential in that period before migration, or
I didn't speak to him. I made a decision early on that I would only ever speak to one party in a marriage, because I thought it was too complicated and unethical to interview both husband and wife, because these also, a lot of these participants were people that I got to know and still know now. And so it wasn't just a kind of question of a one-off interview. I was aware that if I knew contradictory information, and they were sharing incredibly private moments with me about, divorces and marital upheavals, and I didn't think it was ethical to then get that perspective from their spouse.
You didn't want to become an arbiter.
No, not at all.
But in this story that you were telling about Hebo, I thought, there was a really interesting observation, and you and perhaps say a little bit about how general it was for the other female participants that you also interviewed, because there was this sense that you were bringing out the issues of autonomy and agency and freedom were not things that were brought about by migration, but were states to be achieved through migration. So that implies that there was something that was already happening for them in their home context, which had generated these desires, which they then believed could be brought about through migration. So it's not that they moved and then became free. You're very clear in your presentation of that, but actually they had this sense of what it was that they wanted and were able to achieve it through migration. That's quite a nice way of sort of thinking about these issues.
Yeah, and that was another thing that I really wanted to challenge, because a lot of the existing literature, especially on Somalis, but perhaps more generally on migrants as well, and movement, and especially when we come to gender and feminism, assumes that migration is the factor that sets women free, if you like. So I actually read research which said that Somali women are taking up divorce on moving to the West because they found their found feminism, or found these newly sort of liberational kind of means to achieve it and things like that. And I think taking a much more longer approach, rather than that kind of one interview, but allowing people to sort of go through their life history, if you like, allows them to present how it was for them and how they reflect back on it. And yes, you're right, a lot of people spoke, not that necessarily explicitly, but you could see in their formation that migration was a vehicle to achieve change, to disrupt what the pattern of life that was going on for them there. I mean, but there is a sense that a lot of them had to move, because of the war, because of refugee displacement. But that doesn't mean that just because they had to move that they were passive, and I think this goes back to the construction of refugees in political discourse, that we assume that refugees are just kind of passive, they're forced out of home, and that's the end of the story. And it never is. People are forced to move, but that doesn't mean they lose their agency. They still make decisions about where to move, when to move, how to move, and people use the means at their disposal in order to do that. So I think there's a lot of different stories in the book that show that in very different ways. So I hope, yeah, I'm really pleased that that comes through so strongly.
No, it was really interesting. And then there's one other sort of concept, I guess, or just again, you know, from reading your book, it provoked me to think about this. And that was this aspect that you point to how being nomadic is a central part of much of Somali culture. And many of the narratives had some element of nomadism sort of woven into the stories and so on. And I was thinking, if being nomadic is so central, then does diaspora have a meaning? Because is it not just that you've traveled further, but you're still who you are? So if your sense of identity is so strongly bound to place, if you leave that place, you become a diaspora of that place. But if part of who you understand yourself to be is always to be moving, then do boundaries even matter? In a sense, or is that partly what creates the strong sense of what it is to be Somali, even outside of Somalia?
I don't have a straightforward answer to that question, but it's a question that actually is vexing the Somali diaspora, for want of a better term. Absolutely, in the UK, I mean, I went to a lot of Somali festivals, and that was the topic of discussion. And you can find similar topics of discussion if you look on the web. You can find they're taking place in the US, in Australia, wherever you see Somalis. There's this ongoing discussion about what it means to be Somali. And if you're born in the diaspora, are you still Somali? If you don't speak the language, are you still Somali? All these kind of difficult questions. So I don't know that there's a straightforward answer, and I don't know that it's for me to answer that either. But what I would say is that I did want in the book to challenge, well, both to consider methodological nationalism, but also to challenge it. And I think diasporas do that. And if we think about, and also nomadism as well as a part of that, keeps doing that. So, you know, the fact is that the Somali nation, if you like, existed well before states were imposed on the people. And so we can say that kind of diasporaness has been a fact of life, or a means of identity, an identity sort of formation, right from many years ago, even before states came about. So that in itself is disruptive to this idea of the state border and the right to move, or the, you know, all that kind of stuff. But then at the same time, identities, you know, national identities and borders do matter hugely to people, and categories matter, and because they're political categories, they give people rights, they give people opportunities, or they deny them or limit them. And so while it's really important to challenge those kind of assumptions in sociology and in policy, it's also important to recognize the significance they have to migrants themselves, and particularly perhaps refugees.
No, that's a wise caution. I mean, thinking about the broad themes of the book, and also bringing it back perhaps to thinking about contemporary issues more specifically, we see that the war in Ukraine and the massive sort of refugee displacement that's occurred as a consequence of that war has generated a considerable amount of sympathy for refugees within Europe. And I was just wondering, given the work that you've done before doing the research, as well as then doing the research and now witnessing this shift in the public sentiment, what possibilities do you think there are for extending that sympathy for all refugees?
Well, on a hopeful note, I think the response, say, by the public to the Ukraine situation really demonstrates that we don't have to be hostile, and it's not a kind of natural given state. And in fact, it also demonstrates the power of political narratives and the media in shaping how we receive people, whether they're refugees or migrants. I think politicians often kind of lazily rely on the assumption that British voters are, broadly speaking, kind of anti-immigration, without taking responsibility for their own role in leading and producing hostile narratives. So, you know, I think what we can say from what we've seen from Ukraine and the situation is it could be the same for other nationalities too, or just sort of more globally in relation to refugees, if we had leaders that were prepared to take their role as leaders and lead the narrative, and stop presenting immigrants as a problem, as an issue that needs to be kind of dealt with and managed, and stop these kind of like, the only way to deal is to make our borders even stronger and tougher and that kind of stuff. And with the welcome scheme for Ukrainian refugees, which let's not forget, that's still been highly problematic. It hasn't worked as well as it should have done. There are still loads of teething problems, but it could ultimately be a model for all refugees. And even now, at this moment in time, there are lots of Afghans and Syrians who are waiting in budget hotels for their asylum claims to be processed. And there are a lot of families waiting who are ready to host refugees. There's nothing to stop them broadening the scheme and saying, okay, well, we want to host Ukrainians, but we've also got a lot of other people here who are waiting for families to host them. Could you step in? Why not? I think the UK, is host to only a tiny fraction of the world's refugees, and we really shouldn't abdicate our responsibility in the kind of international responsibilities in that area. But I also think that this is a clear demonstration that it's actually about political discourse that is leading hostility and not the other way around. And so therefore, political discourse can change us and make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that perhaps also comes out is the way in which this discourse of them being like us is what's enabling the refugee integration in a much more positive way. And I think one of the things that your book does incredibly powerfully also is to demonstrate how the Somali community is very much like us as well, concerned about the same sorts of issues, the same sorts of reflections on what it means to be within these sorts of relationships, how one navigates the complexities and the problems and the fun as well, and the joy and the laughter and the the conviviality of just being together and so on. And so there's something incredibly humane about the book in the way in which it really pulls to the fore a sense of people, both in terms of the practices and understandings that may make them distinct as a population, but also the very many commonalities and the almost sort of the everydayness of those interactions as well. So you've done a remarkable job in sort of both presenting that distinctiveness, but not making it other, making it interesting, and highlighting very much those commonalities as well, which make them just like us in terms of dealing with the world and the different things that the world throws at us. So thank you so much for the book. It's been a pleasure to read it and to engage with you about it. And I was just wondering, are there any final things that you really hope that people will take away from reading the book?
Yeah, I think I'd love sociologists to really take away the methodological implications. I'd really like reflexivity to be much more deeply integrated through a lot of the sociology I read, and rather than just being a kind of one-line nod at the beginning of a paper, but really embedded throughout the process. And I hope that my book is a kind of, in one way, a kind of manual or a showcase on how that's possible and how it can work. And I'd really like people to read it in that way. And yeah, politically, I guess the discussion we just had, but people are people all the world over. And yes, let's be more open and less hostile.
Well, that's a wonderful note to finish. So here's the book. Absolutely go and read it. It's a brilliant book. Thank you so much, Natasha, for this conversation.